It's like a hangout, or is it? Oh, this is cool. How many people do you get out?
All right, well, hello everyone. My name's Melissa, and thank you so much for inviting us to be here today. Now, before I begin today, I want to start with a question, as many of us have been doing. When I say the word atomic bomb, what image comes to your mind? Take a moment to really imagine that. Maybe it's the mushroom cloud, that infamous picture we see all the time. Maybe it's Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Some of us might even be thinking about the recent film Oppenheimer, right? But let me ask, how many of you were thinking about the unaware scientists that were behind the scenes developing the bomb? Or what about the Congolese miners that dug uranium with their bare hands? Or did you know about the Korean survivors who died as a result of the atomic bomb in Japan? These are stories that are often left out of our retelling of this history. Because the atomic bomb, the story is not limited to Japan and the United States. It's a global one. It's a story that impacts people and has consequences that spans continents and decades. So there's a danger. There's a danger in studying history through a single lens, through a single nation, through a single perspective. So what I want to do today is I want to zoom out. I want to zoom out to look at the how and the why of the bomb, but I also want to zoom in to look at the individual stories of those who were impacted. So journey with me as I move through 3 short vignettes, beginning with the scientists, and then the miners, and the survivors. So let's begin with the scientists. So imagine you are a young scientist in the 1940s. You're being told, look, Nazi Germany has the potential to develop the atomic bomb. You're scared, I'm scared, we're all scared, right? This idea that, no, Hitler could get there first is what drove the Manhattan Project. Or so that's what we were told. According to the records of the Manhattan District engineers, from 1942 to 1948, one of the scientists, and I want to read the quote here, said this: "Right up until the time the Germans surrendered in the spring of 1945, we thought that the Germans would be the target for the atomic bomb." But you see, by the time Germany fell, the bomb wasn't ready yet. But this machine of research and funding, it kept on moving. Billions had been poured into this project, thousands were hired. How could we not use the weapon? There's actually research now that shows us, evidence that shows us that the decision to drop the bomb on Japan instead of Germany was made long before the war ended. Some say as early as May of 1943. Why? Apparently, American planners believed that had the bomb been dropped on German targets and it had failed, they believed that Germans are more likely to secure knowledge from it. What does that tell us about how they viewed the Japanese? But more importantly, this whole time, the pitch behind the Manhattan Project was that Germany is the enemy. This presumed bomb is the whole reason we're moving forward at such an unprecedented rate, and this urgency that we have around building this destructive weapon. And mind you, at this time, the Japanese were already in the process of drafting means for surrender. Which brings me to a haunting question. Had the scientists known that the bomb was to be dropped on Japan instead of Germany, how many would have walked away? And if the people who created the bomb, who developed the bomb in the first place, have no voice or even awareness of how it's going to be used, should they have developed the bomb at all? So as we think about that, I'm going to shift gears. I want to talk about how the bomb was made. And we heard about this from a number of our wonderful presenters. But to do this, we're going to move away from the labs in the United States, and we're going to travel to the heart of Africa, specifically to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Here is where Shingolowe stood. This, Shingolowe, is the largest uranium deposit ever to be discovered. So, of course, when the Americans found out about it, they sent their agents there right away, agents from the OSS. The OSS is what would later become the CIA, right? You see, the uranium that was extracted from Shingolowe was foundational to the creation of the atomic bomb and the entire nuclear project at that. But not much, at least I didn't learn anything about the people who were killed, exploited, and the people who just extracted this radioactive material. But you see, the Congolese miners, they worked with very rudimentary tools, and sometimes even with their bare hands. You can imagine the death and the risk and the danger of a job as such. But of course, the danger doesn't stop there. The suffering doesn't end there. Because you see the communities that went on to process the uranium, cancer, contaminated soils, blood diseases, devastated communities and beyond. And you know, mining in Congo is ongoing today. But this time for cobalt. Why cobalt? Well, it's the material that powers our smartphones in our pockets right now. And it's making a lot of money for some companies. Right? And that is a stark reminder that the legacy of imperialism, colonial exploitation, and the human cost of technological process is ongoing. It's not a relic of the past. It's happening right now. Canada is not an innocent actor by any means. Again, we heard that extraction did only come from the Congo, but it also was happening in Northwest Territories in the Dene community, right? We learned about the village of widows. Finally, I want to return back to Japan. I want to return to the time the bombs were dropped. When the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not all the victims were Japanese. In fact, there were tens and thousands of Koreans who lived in Japan. If you're familiar with the history, there were a lot of forced laborers or indentured workers that were living in Japan from Korea because of the Japanese colonial system. Right? So survivor groups now estimate that there were over 50,000 Koreans who were killed by the atomic bombs in Japan. Let me introduce you to a gentleman. His name is Shim Jin Tae. He survived the atomic bombs, and he is now 83 years old. In a recent interview, he said this: "No one takes responsibility. Not the country that dropped the bomb, not the country that failed to protect us. America never apologized. Japan pretends not to know. In Korea, they're no better. You see, these survivors, they returned back home to Korea, living through the war, living through the atomic bombs. They came home to ostracism, poverty, and neglect. And their descendants to this day are fighting for justice, and they're still excluded from support laws. Their story has become one that no one wants to claim. So why do I talk about all of this? What is the point of these three pictures? When we look at the story of the atomic bomb, and we look at it through a single narrative, a single perspective, from a single nation, we miss out on those who made, mined, and mourned its power. The atomic bomb was never just a moment in history, right? As we learned, it was a product of scientists' ambition, from colonial extraction and human suffering that crossed borders. So, when we study history, we cannot afford to look at it as isolated events. We have to understand the how, and we have to ask who was made invisible in this process. And so, as I pass the time to my colleague Eunice, we will learn about how historical thinking helps us uncover these connections, and how theory helps connect science, empire, and humanity. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Melissa, for sharing the stories of the scientists, the miners, and the unrecognized survivors. Indeed, the history and the story of the atomic bombs is a transnational one, which means that it is and should be treated as an international concern. Now, what Melissa shared with us is a very specific way of looking at history. It is called multi-perspectivity, and as the name implies, it is a method of analyzing historical events through multiple points of view. Well, multi-perspectivity is about including those varieties of perspectives, but it is also about challenging our own biases and our own tendencies to prefer one narrative over another. By analyzing the story of the atomic bombs through a multi-perspective lens, we are opened up to all of these stories of people who are so long been silenced, which is exactly what Melissa highlighted so poignantly in her section. But you see, the history of the atomic bombs is important to learn because in using this lens, the atomic bombs did not come out of nowhere. But in fact, they were the product and the result of an escalating war and the advances in science and weapons development that supported and allowed that escalation. So you see, as we all know, World War II in Asia culminated in the devastating effects of the atomic bombs. But even before the atomic bombs, the United States dropped approximately 42,700 tons of incendiary bombs onto 66 different cities in Japan, including Tokyo. Conversely, the same technique of indiscriminate bombing was used by the Japanese military during the war on countless Chinese cities, including Chongqing. The firebombing of Chongqing took place between 1938 and 1943. And in these 5 years of intense, continuous bombing, 9,500 Japanese planes dropped approximately 21,700 bombs onto Chongqing, bombarding the city at least 117 times. More than 36,000 civilians were either injured or killed in the firebombing of Chongqing alone. And so when we talk about nuclear disarmament, when we come to summits like this, we have to remember and we have to study the history in the context of the massacres, the firebombing, the human experimentation, the biological and chemical warfare of World War II in Asia. And the reason is because every single one of these atrocities is fueled by the same harmful ideologies of colonialism, militarism, and racial supremacy. Let's not forget that the Congolese miners, the indigenous miners, and the Korean Hibakusha were all colonized subjects. And the scientists of the Manhattan Project, knowingly or not, were contributing to a system of militarism. Therefore, when we talk about nuclear disarmament, we have to equally advocate for decolonization, for justice, for equality, and most importantly, for human dignity. Because all of these systems of oppression that I have talked about are deeply, deeply interconnected. But you see, not everyone is happy with a multi-perspective take on history. There are some out there who would prefer to be remembered solely as victims, as martyrs, or as heroes. But if we don't study with a multi-perspective lens, then the nuances of historical thinking and historical events are lost. So you see, it's very, very important to bring back these people into our narratives because history is made up of people, and people contain multitudes. Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie had once said that, and I quote, "The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar." At the beginning of this presentation, Melissa asked you what comes to mind when you think about the atomic bombs. And whatever it was that you thought about, why do you think that is what you thought about? What makes us remember a certain part of the history of nuclear bombs or nuclear weapons more than another? And ultimately, it comes down to the historical narratives that you are most familiar with. And this is not a bad thing. It all depends on the stories that you've been exposed to. And it's different for everyone. It depends on the stories you've read, the books you've read, the movies you watched, the people you talk to, and what your family and your schools teach you. And your family stories, for example, maybe they have a different narrative than what your schools tell you, but that doesn't make it less true. So you see, the history is increasingly complex. But history must be representational and it must be authentic. And to get to that authenticity, we have to include a variety of stories, stories from eyewitnesses and survivors, artifacts, researchers, and people like you. The thing is, we have conflicting narratives and perspectives around the atomic bombs. But why is that? Why do we have different perspectives? Well, each narrative is driven by a different motive. And we cannot talk about the single historical narrative without talking about power dynamics. Because each narrative is driven by a different motive. And different powers want different stories to be told. Power over history means having power over our collective memory. And those who so want to create a single narrative that fits their perspective and their ideas and ideals will so often attack universities and museums and scholars and writers and intellectuals because they know that history and literature have the power to change and shape the way we remember events. I want to bring your attention to this artwork that has been the background to Melissa and I's presentation. Created by 17-year-old Reina Zhu, this piece, titled Oleanders After Time, depicts a mushroom cloud behind a clock, stopped at exactly 11:02 a.m., the time at which the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. But this painting, as Reina explains in her artistic statement, is not simply about the bombing, it's not simply about the time of the bombing specifically, but rather that it emphasizes the way that although time stopped, life did not. We remember the history, but do we remember the lives behind it all? Multi-perspective histories can open us up to all the people who have been left out of our so standardized narratives. And of course, bringing in the stories of the scientists, the Congolese miners, the indigenous miners, and the Korean hibakusha will help us to create a more comprehensive view of the very complex history of the atomic bombs. You see, there is great power in single stories, like highlighting a single scientist or a single person. It is very important to do so because it can help to humanize a history. However, it is never a definitive representation of history. History is multifaceted, which means that we should study it as such. Thank you.
Thank you, Eunice. I'm sure I speak for many of us to just be so inspired and learn so much from the insights that you shared with us today. So with the time we have next, I just want to think about how we could use this to look at our current events. So Eunice, help me out here. With our understanding and what we learned about multi-perspectivity, how can we use that to look at current events today? And how can we use that to understand disarmament?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for about the current events, I'm going to take this in two parts. But for current events, I think in a world that so often wants instant gratification, I think it's important to take a step back and use multi-perspective thinking, especially when approaching your own position on very complicated historical and political or socioeconomic issues. I think it's important to take that step back, do your own research, approach the research critically as well before forming a position. And I think that's so important, especially now when our issues become more and more complicated. As for nuclear disarmament, I think it's really important for us to root our advocacy in history, because we all know this history. We've heard it countless times. And so by having our advocacy rooted in proof, really, it brings so much power behind what we are doing here today.
That's such a great point, and I will be sure to use that as I approach the headlines and the information that I encounter every day. Now, I actually want to get to know you, Eunice. I'm very inspired by you. I think many of us are inspired by you for your love for history and just the fact that you're here. And so I want to know what brought you here. What do you do for your work, and what brings you to speak on this so passionately?
Yeah, I think my love for history started out when I was really young. My parents, to entertain my sister and I at the dinner table, they would tell us stories from their childhood. So I was always interested in the past and kind of seeing where we've come today. When I got older, I was blessed with some amazing history teachers who really showed me that history is not about numbers, it's not about dates, but rather it's about people and it's about human connection. As for how I got here on the stage, I actually, as you heard in my bio, that I spent a lot of time in my undergraduate researching the heirlooms of Chinese Canadian soldiers in the Second World War. And that research project really opened up so many doors for me. I ended up being able to meet the surviving family members of these soldiers, and it really created such a great network for me. And then I went on to apply to the Asia Pacific Peace Museum and Alpha Education, and I got it, so here I am. But I really do enjoy the work, and the advocacy is amazing. Thank you.
Fantastic. Yeah, this is incredible. So, thinking about history, I don't know. First of all, thank you to the teachers who are here, right? Because I mean, Eunice and I would not be on the stage had it not been for our incredible history and humanities teachers in high school. So really, you guys are the champions here. But yeah, I want to understand the role of a historian then in social justice work. You identify as a historian, you call yourself a historian. Where do historians fit into this picture?
I think historians have a very important role in this because it helps us position ourselves in history. And I think that's a very big misconception about history where there's a right and a wrong, and but I think that's a little too black and white when it comes to complicated things like our past. I think historians, our role in this is to provide you with all of the information, is to provide you with the facts, the history, even the untold history, so that you can make your own informed decisions, with especially thinking critically about these issues.
And so I'll wrap it up with one final question here. What is your message to the students here that may be passionate about history or passionate about social justice?
I think I mentioned this before, but I think it's really, really important for us to find our own position in history. The reason I feel so passionately about World War II in Asia is because my own family has been personally impacted by it. My grandmother had to escape Japanese occupation by going into the jungles of Borneo. My grandfather lived through the occupation of Hong Kong. My other grandfather was in China during the war. And so this is a personal history for me, which is why I feel so strongly about it. And for all of you who are interested in history, I think really find where you fit into all of this. And I think it really, really helps to contextualize your own life and your own impact. Was there another part to that question? Okay, yeah. But essentially, I think you really just have to stick with it. I love history so much because it lets me see where my family has come from. And I think that is missing from a lot of our thinking today, which is so individualistic. But yeah.
And something I will add to that too is it's not a weakness to care. When I was in high school a while ago, there was a label attached to those of us who cared, social justice warriors. And that was somehow a bad thing. But those of you that are sitting here right now, it shows that you care, and you should take pride in that, because there's $1 billion machine out there telling you and brainwashing us to say, no, you shouldn't care, you should just go about your lives. But that didn't work on you. And so you should be proud of that. So let's keep working hard. Let's have hope and fight for that world peace. And I believe that we can do it. So thank you all so much for having us today. And I look forward to the rest of our great summit.
Thank you. In a world where media literacy is getting harder and harder to teach, especially with radicalization and just social media constantly feeding us what we want to hear, what are some ways that educators can introduce the idea of multi-perspective thinking in a way that is not comfortable, because we learn when we're uncomfortable, but in a way that is meeting students at their level?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love this question because I do a lot of work around democracy at Elections Canada. But this is a great question because it's a matter of the information we interact with. The information that we interact with is what shapes our way of seeing the world. And so if we are aware of what the algorithm is doing, then we can begin to dismantle it. And one way that I love to do it is just by talking to people. And that happens, in my opinion, the best way to do that is in the classroom. Because in the classroom, you get people from all over the world with different perspectives, different experiences. So rather than focusing on the information we see online, think about the community-sourced information we can get just in our own classrooms or in our communities. Have a conversation with someone who maybe doesn't have the same belief as you. And embrace the discomfort. I've seen it live where, two people don't have the same view and the conversation shuts down. That's it. I'm going to talk to someone who agrees with me. Right? Have that conversation. Just have the open-mindedness and the willingness to listen. I think that is a very powerful tool, especially in a world that is so polarized and so divisive. Right? Being able to listen and have an open mind. So thank you for that question.